Get you, Lynn?
You got me.
The Enosbug-Richford Unified Union School District annual meeting is hereby called to order. And I will remind attendants this evening that voting members are only residents of Enosburg and Richford. So for any of our business this evening, please keep that in mind. All right, so I will go to Mort for Article 1, please.
Okay, at this time, Article 1 is to elect a moderator, so I will take any nominations for a moderator.
I nominate Pat Hayes.
Second.
Second. Any other nominations? No other nominations? Pat?
All those in favor?
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay.
Luck of the draw. All right, Article 2, to elect a clerk for the ensuing year. Nominations are in order.
I'll nominate Billy Joe Draper.
All right, Billy Joe Draper, name has been placed in nomination. Is there a second?
I second.
So moved. Any further nominations? Any further nominations? Hearing none, all those in favor of electing Billy Joe Draper as our clerk for the coming year, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Congratulations, Billy Joe. Article 3, to elect a treasurer for the ensuing year. Nominations are in order.
I nominate Fran Jackson.
Fran Jackson's name has been placed in nomination. Is there a second?
I'll second it.
And seconded. Any further nominations? Any further nominations? Hearing none, all those in favor of electing Fran Jackson as our treasurer for the ensuing year, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Fran has been elected. Article 4, shall the Enosbug-Richford Unified Union School District vote to elect all officers by Australian ballot? A motion is in order.
Do we have questions?
The article that we're voting on is to elect all officers by Australian ballot.
So moved.
So moved. Is there a second? And seconded. Thank you. Discussion on the motion. I think it's self-explanatory, but any discussion? Yes.
How else would the officers be elected at a meeting?
Go ahead.
There's no objection?
Hmm?
You want to see if there's any objection? Or?
Non-resident.
You're not I didn't ask for any, there was an objection prior to the meeting, but is there an objection to a non-resident speaking this evening? Any objections? Okay, go ahead.
So for this article, you've just elected moderator, clerk, and treasurer at this meeting, which has to be this day of the week, this month. What this article would do, if it passes, it would move those three offices to be elected on town meeting day by ballot, along with the school board directors. What we've found recently is that in addition to this meeting, we still are required to have a meeting within 10 days of town meeting. It's purely informational, so we would still have that, but this meeting would no longer have any official business that needs to be done on it.
Does that answer your question? Okay. We'll go back to the article at hand. All those in favor of electing officers by Australian ballot, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. So moved. Now a presentation by administration.
Thank you. So on town meeting day on the 5th, or if you're voting early by ballot, the first article that you will see on the school ballot is to elect the school directors. There are 3 seats that are up this year. Normally there are 2, 1 for each town, but we had some midterm resignations that were filled temporarily, and the voters now get to vote on those positions. So there is a school year director for a remaining year of a 3-year term representing Enosburg, and then a full 3-year term representing Enosburg, and a full 3-year term representing Richford. Those town designations specify who is allowed to run for the seat, but all voters in both towns are going to vote for all 3 seats. So you'll be able to vote on all 3 of those. Currently, there's only 1 person running for each of those 3 seats. There is an opportunity to write in candidates if you so choose. Before we get into a discussion about the budget article, we kind of like to set the stage with some district level information. What you see up on the screen now are the enrollment history for the last 5 years, and then enrollment projections for the next 5 for the 2 high schools and the 2 elementary schools in the district. We can make this available to folks if they want to see it later, but you'll see some trends here. First, I would note in 2020, the second column on that chart, you'll see that all the schools dropped, and that was the first year of COVID, where all the schools across the state lost a lot of kids either going to homeschooling or kind of falling off the radar in general. As we work through COVID, you'll see all the trend lines kind of generally start to creep up, and as we get a few more years away from the beginning of COVID, we expect to see a lot of these lines sort of flatten out. If you look at the 2 high school charts on there, which are the 2 lighter colored ones, Enosburg on top and then the lighter red for Richford High School, you'll see in both of them we're expecting the population to rise for a little while and then level off. We've got some big classes coming up district-wide in 7th and 8th grade, and as they move to the high schools, it's going to bring those numbers up. Conversely, at the elementary schools right now, we see a little bit of a decline coming, and then those 2 flattening out as well. And so no huge, no dramatic trends here, and it's, I think, important to note that we're bucking the trends of the state, which is seeing declines generally across the board, especially in the southern parts of the state. So Article 6 on your ballot is the main one that we're here to discuss tonight, and this is the article that gives the school board authority to spend for the next year. So you'll be asking to approve that $24.5 million number, which is the number that we're going to be discussing for the next half hour or so. Before we get into the details of that, I want to acknowledge for folks the chaos that's been going around in the state around budgeting this past year, more so than certainly any of the years that I've been doing this. This is the first year of Act 127, which fundamentally changed not how we raise taxes, but how we count kids in the state. And we'll go into that a little bit later in some depth. But that's caused a lot of uncertainty in terms of what that $24 million number is going to mean in terms of a tax rate. There's a bill that has been passed through the House and Senate and was signed by the governor today that was fixing some of those problems. And so if you grabbed a handout up top when you came in, you'll see what is our best projection for tax rates as of today. We know that number's going to change. I think there's reason to think it's going to get better over the next couple of months, but we wanted to get that information for you because it is changing so rapidly. I'm going to actually turn this over to Lynn. The beginning of our budget conversation with the board starts with the board's overarching goals, and I'll let her talk about that.
So for several years, the FNESU board has been working on their mission, their vision, and the goals that we want to set for the organization. So we have been working collectively for a couple of years on 3 big goals. They're centered around all students reading on grade level by the end of grade 3 by June of 2027. The second one is around, the language of this one has changed just a little bit recently. In that one, starting with the class of 2028 and beyond, those students will be graduating based on demonstrating proficiency of the skills in our Portrait of a Learner, which is highlighted in all of the annual reports. So if you didn't get one, some up here. And the last goal is by June of 2027, all students will be reading on grade level by the end of their grade band around social emotional learning skills. So as we're building this budget and in all the work that we're doing, we're keeping our eye on those goals. So we're making sure that our expenditures are aligned with the priorities we have for the organization. So we have invested pretty significantly around early literacy, and we're investing in the work around our Portrait of a Learner, and based on the needs of our students and community, social emotional learning has become a big priority for us, as it should.
So we then talked with the board about some of the global big picture trends that we see that we know we're going to have to react to in the budgeting process. On this list, the first, looks like first 5 of these are really trends that are facing everyone in the state. Everyone is seeing, coming out of COVID, higher number of kids with social emotional needs and needing more support just to be ready for education. As I mentioned, this is the first year of Act 127, which has really fundamentally changed the game for the better for a lot of poorer rural communities like ours. The federal COVID funding is expiring in this next fiscal year. That money is going to be going away by September, so this is the first budget year where we've had to look at that and said, these positions which were funded under that grant are important enough to bring into our local budgets. PCB remediation has been getting a lot of press in the state. All of our schools in Enosbug-Richford were identified as needing to be tested for PCBs. We still have some uncertainty. We know that Richford Elementary and Cold Hollow Career Center are both clean and there's no remediation needed there. We've got some ongoing testing that's going on at Enosburg Elementary, and we do not have results yet for our 2 high schools, which are our 2 oldest buildings and the 2 buildings that had the most work in different generations. So we've got some concerns there, and we know that at least as of tonight, there is no dedicated, stable funding stream to cover that, those remediation costs. And a lot of schools in the state who have already been identified and are likely to suck up the little money that was allocated last year. Lastly, statewide health insurance premium increases have gone up 16.4%. This is the second year of double-digit increases on health care. A few years ago, we moved to a system where the healthcare benefits were negotiated statewide rather than district by district. The advantage of that was that we didn't have districts playing off each other as we had in the past. But if you look at it with any sort of clear eye, the move to the statewide system has not saved us any money. And two points specific to Enosburg-Richford. We are in negotiations with our support staff union. We've had a few meetings with them, but we're not close to a settlement. And so when we go through the budgeting process, we're making guesses as to where those salaries are going to end up. We think there's enough money in this budget for the staff we're proposing and where we think the settlements are going to land, but we won't know that until the agreement is inked. And then finally, as I mentioned before, there's a large 8th grade class specifically in the Northern Mountain Valley District, which is Bakersfield, Berkshire, Sheldon, and Montgomery. The 2 high schools in this district get most of those kids, and so we are expecting to see more revenue from that district because those 4 towns and any other towns that are sending kids here are sending tuition money into the district to help pay for that. As I'll show you later, staffing makes the biggest part of our budget, so I'm going to go through in some detail the staffing changes that this budget that's in front of you propose. Overall, before we start, the budget would be adding just under 6.5 licensed positions. So those are positions for someone who holds a teacher license, whether they're teachers or administrators. A cut of almost 3 support staff for a net of 3.75 FTE increase across those 5 schools. That increase is really largely driven by pulling staff out of that ESSER federal grant I mentioned, some other grants where we've got pieces and parts of staff that we're needing to pull into the local budget as well if we're going to keep them. So in Enosburg Elementary, proposing a cut of 1 day a week of an art teacher, and then a reduction of 3 paraeducators, staff who've been moved to the SU budget already. In Richford Elementary, proposing increasing the assistant principal position, which is funded partially locally and partially out of that ESSER grant. So it's the same person, it's just pulling that money into the local budget. Increasing the art teacher to full-time, up from 2 days a week. A little bit more paraeducator support at Richford Elementary, and then bringing the family engagement coordinator, who's currently hired and paid out of the ESSER grant, pulling that into the local budget. At Enosburg High School, the addition of an art teacher full-time and the addition of a half-time French teacher, pulling that position up to full-time. We are reducing a technology assistant position, one that was vacant. There was a vacancy this year that was created, and we have not filled that to date. Moving 1.5 days a week of a full-time interventionist out of one of our other federal grants. The position is there, but it's been shared between local and the grant budget. And then moving a flexible pathways advisor position, again, out of that ESSER grant into the high school budget. At Richford High School, a shared position between a family engagement coordinator and a health teacher, which is currently 3/4 paid out of ESSER. That would now be fully in the local budget. We've got some fractional FTE teachers that we've reduced, and then an additional full-time teacher that would be to be hired at the high school. And then finally at Cold Hollow, moving a half-time teacher from the federal Perkins grant into the local budget. That's a position that we've had for several years now. It's always been able to be split from between Perkins and the local budget. And Nate can talk more about this if you'd like, but with a lot of these grants, there are restrictions that eventually they want to see taking on what you've committed to in the grant. So again, overall, it's about a 3.75 FTE, almost four people increase from the previous year. All of those are coming out of grants primarily. These charts are also in your book, but I'll kind of walk through them quickly here. This first one is for the Enosburg district, and it is showing you what we buy. And so that red 3/4 of the pie are the staff that you have in your buildings. That first half are the salaries, and then the dark red and the light red pieces are the benefits for those staff. So those are the people that we hire and we pay through our payroll. And that's really the biggest chunk of the budget. You'll see continuing around the clock, starting at like 8 o'clock where that blue section begins. We've got some contracted services, so those might be contracted mental health workers from NCSS, as an example. Property services would be things like your electric, your snow plowing. You've got a small slice there, that light blue is tuition payments. That would be money that you send to other tech centers for your high school students who are attending other tech centers other than Cold Hollow, as well as pre-K tuition that we are required to pay out in some cases. That next big chunk, the blue section, is a bit of a catch-all. It has the supervisory union assessment in there, which is primarily food service, special ed teachers, and transporting kids to and from school. Another smaller part of that is the central office for some of the folks here who are talking. Debt is very small slice of the pie now that the biggest bonds have been retired. And then that green section, about 5% is the stuff that we buy. So that's the crayons and the paper and the pencils. It's also the utilities, so your natural gas bills come out of there, your fuel bills, electric bills come out of there. So it's important to keep this in mind, and we do this for the board as we get a first draft of the budget and then decide to look where we're going to be able to trim. There's a perception out there that that green slice is really where we spend all our money, and if only we bought less stuff, we'd be able to drop our tax rate. Really what we spend money on in this district and across the state in education is people. The next pie chart looks at what we do, and so that green section is really what we call instruction, and that's kids in seats in front of teachers for the most part. And that's what we spend a little over half of our money on. Coming around from about 7 o'clock, I realize I'm going to have to change that metaphor now that people don't use analog clocks anymore. Starting from the bottom, working up the left side, that first big piece of pie in the light blue is student support, so that would be guidance counselors primarily. You would have nurses in there as well. The next light blue section, instructional support, would be your librarians, technology, professional development for teachers. There's a small piece there for the school board and some of the district level insurances that we pay. That next piece, lighter blue, is school administration. It's your principals in your 5 buildings. The biggest piece of the blue pie there, central services, is again the supervisory union assessment. So food service, transportation, special ed, and the superintendent's office. And then that last big piece is buildings and grounds. So that's the cost that we incur to keep our 5 buildings up and running. We did a similar thing SU-wide. So what we did there, and this was primarily for the board's benefit, is we took the Enosbug-Richford budget, we took the Northern Mountain Valley budget, and then we took the supervisory union budget, pushed them all together to kind of show again where we're spending our money. So that big blue half of the pie is direct instruction. So again, kids in seats, and then working our way around, we have special education, vocational education, athletics, that's student support, guidance and nurses, instructional support, librarians and technology, board administration. The green wedge is school administration, so primarily principals. Central services is that superintendent office slice in orange, and then buildings, transportation, and food service. And that is in your town book. And then the last pie chart looks at the supervisory union budget only, but where we spend the money. So starting at the very top in that very light blue is for Bakersfield Elementary, and that is primarily special education teachers. Those are the ones that we, at the beginning of the year, know that this teacher's going to be spending all their time in this school, and so we can track that. That works all the way around through to that big green section is where we're starting to look at the more centralized functions. So that green quarter, fifth of the pie is food service. The light blue slice at the bottom is transportation. And then that big pink section are the costs that we don't allocate out to schools. So it's not only a LIN central office, but it'll be things like the instructional coaches who might go to different buildings from year to year depending on where our new teacher hires are and where those teachers are that need that support. Our English language learner teachers, we don't say you're going to have to spend one day in this building, one day in that building. They're going to be moving around to where the need is.
OT, PT, OT and PT.
And yeah, occupational therapists, physical therapists, people who don't have a set schedule. So before we go on from that and get into Act 127, which is a lot denser, I'm happy to pause there and see if there are any questions on what we've covered so far. We can certainly come back at the end to anything that we're presenting. Okay. So we talked a little bit about, you can go to the next one. We talked a little bit at the beginning about Act 127. So in Vermont, we have a constitutional guarantee for kids to have equal access to funding. After the Brigham decision in 1998-ish, we moved to a system where to do that, the state looked at the kids that we have in our buildings and gave different weights to different kinds of kids because they assume that someone who doesn't hear English spoken at home is going to be more expensive to educate than someone who does. Someone who's coming to school from a home that's in poverty is going to cost more than somebody who doesn't. So they did that with Act 60, and we've been living under that for a long time. But when they set those up, they didn't really have or didn't go looking for any data. They just assumed that this kid costs more to educate than this kid. What Act 127 did was to hire UVM to correct that deficiency. So the formula is still the same, or the process is still the same, but those weights are very different. So as an example for this district, when the state is figuring out the number of kids that we get to count here in Enosbug-Richford, they looked at what's called an average daily membership, which is the kids that are here in September, October. And we had about 878 kids, 878 actual real kids. Of those, 12 were identified as receiving English language learner services. Under the old system, those 12 we got to count as 15. Under the new system, those 12 we got to count as 42. So they've recognized that those kids cost a lot more to educate than we had thought in the past. Similarly, with poverty, we have 612 kids that they've identified as living in poverty. Last year, we would have been able to count them as 765, so we're getting basically an extra 25% for each of those kids. This year, we're counting them as 1,242 kids, so we're basically getting to count each kid a little bit more than twice. And so what this has done is districts that have high levels of poverty, high levels of EL kids, have really seen a pretty dramatic increase in the number of kids they get to count, and so the amount of money they get to raise for a given tax rate. The intent of this was to allow districts like ours, who saw that increased capacity, to be able to invest money and spend it on those kids who historically have not gotten the resources that they should have. Similarly, the districts that had seen a drop in that capacity, the intention was that those budgets would come down, but they were given a 5-year glide path to get there. The glide path that they had created this incentive whereby a handful of districts, 20, 30, 40 in the state, figured out that they could add a significant amount of money to their budget and their tax rate wouldn't change at all. And so I don't want to talk about the intent of those districts because we all have roofs that need to be fixed and we all have kids with needs, but they were able to to add quite a bit of money and think that they were not going to have to pay for it. The bill H50 that just was signed today was passed in part to correct that. And so that's why the handout that's there, the rates have changed so much from what we thought we were going to be looking at 2 weeks ago. That bill was signed into law today. It has given all districts, but it was really intended to give those districts a chance to pull back their budgets and rewarn them without going to vote. So we're expecting that a handful of those districts, 5 go out and pull $10 million out each, that we could see a pretty significant further drop in the tax rate.
Maybe one more point about those districts that were able to benefit from that 5% tax rate cap. They could have the additional spending without it costing them any more in their tax rate. But for all of the other districts that didn't reach the 5% tax rate cap, the funding for those obligations would have had to have come out of those districts. So that wasn't the intent of the law, and the legislature has moved really quickly to correct that. And H850 has gone through incredibly quickly. So we were at one point in this budgeting process pretty worried about what that was going to do to us. So with this correction in H850, what this looks like for us is much better than it could have been.
And so the way that played out here is when this board approved their budget in early January, they did it assuming that they were bringing you a 3.5-cent tax rate decrease before the COA. Once the state started looking at the cost of those caps, those districts that were able to spend more than they were supposed to raise, that they started recalculating what they were going to need to raise in terms of taxes, and that 3.5-cent decrease pretty quickly went up to an increase. They looked further and they figured out that if they didn't do something, every district's tax rate would have to keep rising and rising until everybody was capped, and they wouldn't be able to raise enough money from the residential grant list. And so they would have to go to income sensitized payers, and they would have to go to non-homestead payers and increase those dramatically. So, we went from 3.5 down to, at one point, if the caps if we weren't eligible for a cap, we would have been 38 cents up. We're now with H50 anticipating, I think it's a 6.5 or 7 cent decrease for that non-residential rate. So it's been a wild ride, at least in terms of the tax rate. Go to the next one. So this is the formula for getting to that tax rate, and we've done this the same way now for 25 years, but I will keep walking through it. If you look at the FY25 proposed column, that's the numbers that we were talking about this year, this March 5th, for next year. FY24 final, the column just to the left of that, are the numbers for the budget year that we're living in right now. So the budget expenses would be the 24.5 million, and that is the figure that you'll be voting on Tuesday. We take out the local grant revenue out of that amount, subtract that out, and then that 18,600,000 is the amount of money that we're going to tell the state we need this much out of the ed fund in order to support this budget. One thing I'd point out here is that you'll see that the local grant revenue has increased pretty significantly. That is almost entirely due to the other district, Northern Mountain Valley, and that big 8th grade class that's going to be coming mostly to your 2 high schools. So you can thank some of the other taxpayers in the room for helping your budget out. Much different conversation on the other side during their budgets, because they're obviously adding $1 million for tuition. That 18.6 million is divided by that long-term weighted ADM, and that's the number that's that we discussed under Act 127. So that's 1722 is the number of students you get to count, even though the actual students you have is in the high 800s. That will get you to your education spending per pupil of $10,844. And that's the number that we use to compare ourselves to other districts in the state. It's the kind of the cleanest number to say, okay, we're spending this much. How much is Burlington spending? How much is Stowe spending? How much are our other neighbors in Franklin County spending? And we'll have a chart to show you that a little bit later. The dollar yield is the numbers that will eventually be set by the legislature. We take the ed spending per pupil, divide it by the dollar yield, and we get that educational residential school tax rate, and that's the district tax rate that we talk about. You'll see that the number in the handout is actually more current than this number up on the slideshow by a couple of dollars. The best number that we've seen right now is $9,775, and that is projected to give an equalized residential school tax rate of $1.10.93. So a fraction down below what you see up on the screen. One other thing that I'll mention on that last slide, because it came up in the earlier meeting, in the NMV meeting, is if you look at that FY24 column, that $16.7 million of education spending, again, that's the money that we tell the state we need from the ed fund. Of that, $2 million was raised on residential taxes in these two towns. 2.7 million was raised on non-residential taxes in these two towns, and the remaining 11.5 million is coming from somewhere else. So some of that's from the lottery, some of that's from meals and rooms tax, but a big chunk of that is coming from property-rich towns elsewhere in the state. So I know on the NMV side, there are a couple of towns that think that they're in that category, and so we ran these numbers to show them that actually up here we are definitely benefiting from this statewide system, and it is taxpayers in other towns that are largely supporting the budget.
Can you talk a little bit about the prediction around the dollar yield as some of the other budgets get rewarned?
Sure. So this budget, if you go back in, the 97, now $75 yield is based on all of the data that the Agency of Education has collected in terms of where people have won their budgets. So I sent these numbers to them. I said, this is what we're going to with the voters. Hopefully this is what we're going to be asking for you. Most of the districts in the state have done that. With this passage of H850 and that ability for districts to rewarn their budget now, we're anticipating that there are school boards that are looking at saying, well, we thought we were going to go to our taxpayers with a $1.50 tax rate. It's now $1.90. We can't do that. And so we're hopeful that some of those districts are going to pull their budgets back, take some of that money out that it certainly was legitimate but wasn't needed maybe for that current year operations. And if that money does come out, it will continue to drive that dollar yield up, drive the tax rate down. In a normal year, we had always figured that another district pulling $10 million out of their budget would cut everyone's tax rate by a penny. So we're hopeful that we'll see a few pennies drop as people go ahead and rewarn their budgets. This is just a graph showing what the district level tax rate is before the CLA since unification. So FY20 was the first year that we operated as unified district. We actually built our two budgets separately that year and merged them together when the state merged the two towns into one district. You'll see that it was pretty steady for the first 2 years, and then it started declining pretty significantly, in large part because of the increase in the gram list statewide, and we'll talk about that probably next. So that the residential rate, and you can look at it there, it's probably better to follow along on this chart. So that 110.93 is the district tax rate, and that is that needs to be equalized for the two towns because the two towns have two different grand lists. And so the way that the CLA works, or what it's trying to correct, is if in FY25 you have a property that on your town grand list is worth $150,000, what that 71% for Enosburg CLA means is that when the state looks at their data, recent sales rather than an appraisal that was done maybe 10, 20 years ago, the state thinks that that $150,000 house is actually worth $201,000. They want you to be taxed on that fair market value. So kind of in Enosburg, and I went back to FY23, that $150,000 listed house in 23 should have been worth, or had a fair market value of $165,000, 24, $179,000, and then in 25, $201,000. So you'll see that that's the trend in properties, which I think we've all been feeling and recognizing as we see properties turn hands or know people who are looking to get into a first home. The story is similar but different in Richford. So in FY23, again, off the left, a $150,000 house would have had a fair market value of $144,000. So a little bit under what the grand list said. In 24, Richford went through a reappraisal, so they went through and looked at all their properties, and those property values changed. And you'll see in a minute what that does to the local tax rate. But in 24, in that first column, you'll see their CLA was 135%. And so what that means is that the state thought that that reappraisal was 35% too rich. And so a person who had a $150,000 house in Richford per the grand list, the state feels like they should only be paying on a $110,000 house. And so that CLA is there to correct those changes or those deficiencies in the grand list. One other point on that, if you look at Enosburg's CLA now of 74%, whenever a CLA drops below 80%, the state starts putting pressure on the towns to do a reappraisal. I don't know if Billy Joe's gone out shopping for one yet, but all 4 towns in NMV need to do a reappraisal, and the one that's been able to sign a contract said that theirs won't start for another 3 years, 2 or 3 years, and won't be done for another 3 to 5 years. So it's a pretty significant problem statewide.
We may have one that's going to start mid-year.
Mid-year this year, that's great. So your district will definitely be in better shape. If we go to the next graph, and this is also updated in this handout that's in front of you, you'll see what the tax rate does after the CLA is applied. So you'll see even though that black line, the district level tax rate has declined for the last 3 years, the tax rate in Enosburg has been sort of slowly creeping up. And that again is due to the CLA and the increasing property values. Richford's was on a trend increasing up until FY24, and that is entirely due to the reappraisal. Their grand list not only got more accurate, it probably moved farther in the other direction. And I think a lot of towns that reappraised have seen that in the past. And then is again starting to swing back up as property values continue to increase. I mentioned earlier that per pupil ed spending amount as the number that we use to compare ourselves to other districts in the state. This chart is every district in the state. At the bottom, that line is at about $8,000 per pupil that's spent. And again, that's that per equalized pupil, so not a real pupil. That top number is about $18,000 and change. So across the state, there's a huge discrepancy in terms of how much money we're spending on our kids. The 2 black lines in the middle of the chart, the first one coming up from the bottom is the Franklin County average, and the one pretty much dead center in the chart is the statewide average. So you can see where those 2 numbers fall. The red lines scattered throughout are the other districts in Franklin County. So those are our 5 neighbors and where they are in terms of per pupil spending. And then the bottom 2 lines in blue are the 2 districts within Franklin Northeast. So if you start from the bottom and go 10 up, that first one is Northern Mountain Valley. You go up another 5, and that's where Enosburg-Richford is this year in terms of per pupil spending. So we, the board, thought it was important to continue to bring that forward. In terms of a gross dollar amount, both budgets are pretty significantly. That is the intent of Act 127, and I would anticipate, because of spending statewide, we are actually still going to be somewhere in the basement next year when we show this chart. Hopefully not at the bottom few steps, but we are still going to be one of the lower spending communities in the state. So I'll pause and see if there are any questions on any of that before we go through the rest of the warning. And again, we can come back at the end as well. Okay. So also on your ballot, Article 7 is an article that we put on every year, asking for authority to borrow money in advance of the state sending money. So we'll tell them at some point when a budget is passed, we need $16 million. In theory, they will send us the first check in September. If one of the towns doesn't get a grand list lodged with the state in time, the state doesn't know how much money to send from each town, and so they send us nothing, and we need to borrow money. And so that's the purpose for this article. We are also asking, as we have in the past, for the authority to take half of the surplus funds from the year that ended last June and put it into a capital reserve fund. So that's money that we will be using potentially to work on PCB remediation if the state doesn't step up. We've also used that in the past to repave parking lots, fix roofs, do some of the major construction fixes that we need to for our 5 buildings. We ended 2003 with about $415,000. The other 207, assuming everything passes, is going back to the district to help drive down that tax rate by penny and a half, 2 pennies. We will hold an informational meeting at Enosburg High School on Monday at 7 p.m. I believe that's going to be in the auditorium. It's auditorium or library, I'm not sure.
One of the 2.
Either the auditorium or the library. We will go over this similar presentation there, and there won't be any action taken, but we'll be happy to talk about the budget and answer any questions on that. And then these are your polling locations where you can vote and the hours that they're open. And early voting has already started, so you can talk to Billy Joe about how to request an early ballot, or I think most town clerks allow you to come in and vote in person during their regular office hours. That's all I have for you.
So I just have a couple of things I want to add. In last night's meeting, there was someone in the crowd that was making a comment on, can you go back to this one, Courtney? To where our NMD and our ER schools land on the spending per pupil list, so that you could see where we are is we've historically hovered around the bottom in terms of what we spend per pupil. And we understand that is because our community does not have the resources that some of the other communities have in the state. At the same time, our students have pretty substantial needs, and we have done, I think, a pretty good job of using the resources that we have to be able to meet the needs of our students. However, I want something more for our students. I want the ability to provide opportunities for these students that they have not had in the past. And I think that, I hope when people go out and vote, they keep that in mind, because you really need to hear the whole story when it comes to what's in this budget. There are increases in spending in this budget, And that's by design. That's because Act 127 was written for communities like ours. Act 127 was intended to provide more opportunities for students who have lived in communities that have historically been underfunded compared to the rest of the state. So we have the opportunity with this law to be able to add these in without it having a tremendously negative impact on our tax rate. So I think it's really important for people to consider that as they look at this. And I think that there is also data in here that I think is really important to take a look at, so that in particular in the Richford data, I think it's really important to take a look at, even though it appears that there's a big jump in the tax rate, people really need to understand that CLA and understand how low that tax rate went last year because of that reappraisal. So I do hope that people will look at this budget favorably. It was very thoughtfully developed, and it was with good intention to be able to provide more equitable opportunities for our students, because we feel strongly that that's what our students need, and we hope that you will too. I do know that, I'm certainly open to answering any questions, and we do have one question online.
So our first question that we have online is, there is an issue with the snack shack at Enosburg Falls High School. Can you speak to how that will be addressed in the budget to have that building repaired? My understanding is a structural issue and repair estimates are being obtained.
I can take that. So the snack shack is a building that the district owns, and it's right next to the soccer field at Enosburg High School. There is a structural issue with the foundation and basement. We've received one quote, which we think probably exceeds the value of the building, and so we're seeking other quotes there. In terms of where the money will come from, it's a capital need, so the board could choose to tap those capital reserve funds for it. The article that we asked about earlier in terms of filling that up. We have also, in the past, when projects have come up, looked at where the general fund budget's going to end in April, May, and decide if we do have space in the budget and we can get things like that done within the current fiscal year. We would do that as well. So I think in terms of funding options, we have a lot that are maybe not specific to the FY25 budget, but we are needing to get more information and get a better price.
Any other questions from anyone else? Any other comments? That's it.
Well, hearing none, I would thank everyone for coming this evening, administrators, and staff, and board members, and everyone involved with our annual meeting. And I entertain a motion to adjourn.
I move we adjourn.
All right, is there a second? And seconded. We are adjourned. Thank you very much for coming this evening.